did you ever notice that sometimes the system's designed to help us actually end us hurting us even more? If you are like many of the people that we deal with every day, you are probably dealing with a very difficult ex in a complex legal system, which involves all kinds of professionals that often get involved, especially when you have children. And one of the ones that we see, one of the agencies that we see get involved often in our world is Child Protective Services or some version of that. So I'm really glad to have Evynne Fair here with us today. She's got this really unique experience, and we're going to talk a bit about vindictive reporting and how to handle CPS or Child Protective Service, with whatever your state or country calls it. So welcome, Evynne, and can you talk a little bit about your background, because you have all kinds of interesting experience that you bring to the table.
Thank you, Lisa, and I appreciate you having me on this episode, and I look forward to chatting with you. So my background is currently, I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Colorado. I primarily practice criminal defense, but my background is I was a law enforcement officer part-time for 8 years, and then I worked for Child Protective Services as an investigative officer for 2 years. Before both of those careers were before becoming an attorney. And so that's kind of my background that I feel is relevant to what we're going to discuss today.
Right. And I think I remember you also saying that you're the child of a difficult divorce. Am I remembering right?
Yes, you are correct. I also was, my parents divorced when I was 3, and my mother actually got sick, and my dad had to move back in with us to help support us back when I was, it would have been 1992. So I have to do math, which I'm not. That's why I'm an attorney, not a mathematician. So let's see, I would have been 8 years old. And then my dad lived with us until I went to college, but my parents remained divorced and lived separately. But there were definitely moments where it was a very tumultuous situation, and my mother was actually more of the perpetrator than my father ever was. And so, yeah, so I have personal background with those types of relationships, and then professional background as well.
Okay, so you're definitely a member of the Been There, Got Out Club.
You got it. Definitely. In more ways than one.
I bet. All right. So I really want to talk about your background. I mean, there's a lot I want to talk about with your background, but working with Child Protective Services. So, obviously something about domestic violence. What have you seen, or what's your experience with how Child Protective Services has affected victims of domestic violence?
Absolutely. So Child Protective Services often gets called, the way that the system is designed is that it should be getting called when there's a safety concern for a child in a home. And oftentimes that can be domestic violence in the home, whether the child is witnessing it, whether the child is a victim of child abuse as part of the domestic violence, or is intervening in the domestic violence. So that, in a perfect system, that is what Child Protective Services is designed to have someone report that, call. We as investigative workers would go out, investigate. Both, you investigate for the safety of the child. So is the child safe enough to stay in the home, or does the child need to be removed because it's unsafe in the home? And then provide resources, hopefully, to help whatever is going on. The problem that you see is that, as you know, domestic violence situations are not as black and white as most may think. It's also not always physical. Sometimes it's very much emotional, power and control. And when Child Protective Services gets involved, it adds, in my opinion, it adds a whole other layer of somebody involved. So now you've got 2 parents, one or more kids. So you've got the family unit that's involved. You've got extended family that might be involved, especially if there's safety planning or removal of the kids. Then you might have law enforcement involved. Sometimes they're the reporting party because they went out on a call. And now you've added a whole other layer of government involvement into what's already a tumultuous situation. And in my experience, I've seen it help, and I've also seen it complicate things, and I've also seen it be weaponized by perpetrators as well.
Okay, tell us about that part. How is it weaponized? Because I feel like that's our world. I feel like CPS, I'll just say CPS, even though I know it's called different things in different places, but CPS is often called and then things end up going awry.
Correct. So one of the things that I did not realize this when I got into law enforcement and when I got into working in CPS, is that you kind of assume, I think, before you get into the system that, well, if someone's making a report that a child's unsafe, there must be a reason. Like, why would anyone make that report? And what I realized when I got into being a worker for CPS, I realized that oftentimes there's perpetrators of domestic violence who are calling CPS against the victim parent and using it as a way to continue to control that person. And so maybe they're losing control in the domestic relations piece or the divorce case, if we want to, again, that's called different things in different states and countries. But let's say they're in divorce proceedings, that's not going well for the perpetrator. Well, now they'll call CPS, knowing that CPS, at least in the United States, and they have a duty to investigate. So at the very least, someone is going to have to contact the child and contact the parent whose these allegations are being made against. And sometimes the perpetrator can use that as a way to get their victim to be the subject of this investigation. And so when you're the CPS worker going into the situation, we have a duty to make sure children are safe and make sure that and investigate these allegations. We have a duty statutorily to do that, but we have to balance that with the thought that, is this vindictive reporting by a perpetrator? And sometimes they get sophisticated enough where they have their family members do the reporting on their behalf. And so it can definitely be used as a weapon, and then it muddies the waters for those true cases, right, where there are true allegations, and it can be very difficult sometimes as a CPS worker to determine, is this a legitimate report or is this vindictive reporting?
Yeah, I know that we've heard that sometimes somebody said that they had a friend who worked in CPS, and the friend said, if we find out that a report's being made and it's in the middle of some kind of litigation, we tend to be more dismissive because we already feel like it's part of a strategy used to harm another person.
Absolutely. I would absolutely say that is the case. And I would say if there's pending criminal charges, also, in the state of Colorado, there's usually mandatory protection orders, which prevent, a defendant from harassing the alleged victim. But if the defendant happens to actually be erroneously the true victim, right? And so, because there's vindictive reporting, in my experience, there's vindictive reporting both criminally and through CPS. And so, it definitely raises that red flag that this might just be a strategy to get back at someone. But there's also the flip side of it where it could be legitimate. And I think it kind of goes to the cry wolf fable, mm-hmm. right? If there's too many people making these vindictive reports, sometimes we'll miss the true dangerous cases. And of course, that was always my fear, is how do you balance those two things?
Yeah. So I'm making sure I remember to ask you this because someone was brought it up to me and I said, "Oh, perfect timing." They said that they're going back for a post-judgment motion and CPS happened to have been called and the report is not finished, but there's a court date. And so this person is thinking, what do I do? Because CPS's report may have a significant impact, but the court date's going to happen. There happened to be an attorney in this meeting, and the attorney said a lot of times the court wants to wait until the report is finished. Have you found that to be true?
Yes, I've seen that. So even though I practice primarily criminal defense right now, I did for a short period of time practice family law. And I in my experience in family law, dealing with divorce and custody cases, and even when I was a CPS worker, courts give a lot of weight to CPS reports. And I think in one sense it's a good idea, because these workers they're in the home, they are interviewing people. That is a luxury the court does not have. The judge does not have the luxury of going into the home and seeing it for themselves, talking to family members, talking to references and stuff like that. So I did see that, and a lot of times it'll delay. So it can be a delay tactic too, because the court's going to want to see what are the findings from that investigation, and then which again, it makes sense, but it can go a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Another thing in our community, since we only deal with high conflict, divorce, separation, custody battles more than anything, is frustration when CPS does nothing. Like I cannot count how many times people have said CPS has been called. There's, other people have seen it. The therapist has seen it. The school's seen it, and CPS just closed the case. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I was a CPS worker in Nevada. So I had the luxury of kind of seeing, and I was in law enforcement in Nevada as well. So I've seen the law enforcement side, the CPS side from Nevada, and then I also worked, and I forgot to mention this in my background, I was a law clerk kind of / staff attorney for Denver Juvenile Court, straight out of law school, where I was the clerk to 5 judicial officers that only heard CPS cases and juvenile delinquency cases. And so I had the opportunity to kind of see how Colorado handles that. I was able to see how the CPS agencies in Colorado dealt with this. And then, of course, doing family law in Colorado. And I would definitely say that it can be very frustrating. I saw 2 different counties in 2 different states dealing with these cases. And I can tell you that there's a cultural thing that can go on. It depends on what caseworker you have. It depends on the admin in that organization and how they are, what kind of culture they're perpetuating in the CPS organization. And it's one of those things where there are CPS workers taking actions when they probably shouldn't be taking actions, and then there's CPS workers who are not taking action when some people think that they should. And I think there's also there's also a piece of it too, that sometimes when people are saying that CPS did nothing, the people who are feeling that way legitimately feel that way. They have invested interest in these children's lives, but sometimes they don't understand what CPS is actually legally allowed to do. I think we all come into this with our own ideals of what parenting should look like, and what your definition of a safety concern for a child is probably going to be different than my definition of a safety concern for a child, and is different from everyone else in this child's life. And so, I dealt with this a lot when I was a worker, is sometimes it just did not rise to the level of something that I, as a worker, was legally able to take action. There would be people who'd want me to remove children from a home, but it didn't meet the safety criteria that was set out to do that. And, sometimes it seems like gambling a little bit. Like, are we gambling with children's lives here? Because you also don't want too strict of standards for CPS workers, because then they might be removing too many children from the home. And so it's this very delicate balance, and there can be a lot of heightened frustrations, rightfully so. I mean, I think these folks are justified in their frustration, but sometimes it's more that the workers' hands are tied rather than just lazy casework. But there can also be lazy casework and just caseworkers completely, not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And unfortunately, we've heard those horror stories across the states where that is the case. So
yeah. Are the standards different in each state for what needs to be met?
It seems to be. It seems there's different models, and it's been several years since I've been in CPS working in it, and so I'm sure things have changed since I've been in it. But when I was in it, you definitely learned that different. So we had what's called a safety assessment in Nevada, and it was actually based off of some studies that were done in Colorado, and Colorado was kind of the forefront at the time of these safety assessments of how to kind of give a more, what's the word, objective analysis to see if a child needs to be removed. And then internally we as a worker, I would go through the safety assessment, and then run it by my supervisor. So I had this like extra level of kind of oversight. But what I learned when I was learning about other agencies is not all states have that system in place or follow that protocol. And in fact, I have heard that it can vary county to county within a state.
Wow.
So, which is kind of disturbing if you think about it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned you were in law enforcement, I tell me if I'm remembering properly, you were a sheriff?
Yeah, so I was a reserve deputy for Carson City Sheriff's Office. So I did it part-time and had a full-time job. Like, I call it a full-time day job. And then I did the part-time reserve deputy stuff kind of on the side, weekends, evenings, special events, stuff like that.
Yeah, so you've probably seen a lot.
Yes, between being a CPS worker and being in law enforcement, you definitely see a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, you said that part of the reason that you left that type of work because empathy harmed you. Can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I consider myself a highly empathetic person. I think that's what brought me into the helping professions. I would imagine, I developed, just based on my own studies and my own work, I've developed a sense of empathy, probably because of the childhood that I had. I had to always be in tune to my parents and how they were acting, how they were feeling, what kind of mood they were in, mostly my mother, to just navigate my childhood. And I think what that does as a child who's in that situation, you develop this kind of affinity to really being able to read people and see things. And what I struggled with both in child protective services and in law enforcement was we're involved in these people's lives at the worst possible moment of their life, right? Nobody's calling CPS or the cops when they're having a good day. They're calling us when they're having a very bad day. And for me, being a super empathetic person, showing up on those calls day in and day out started to take a toll on me, because I would worry, how did these families get here? You would see the generational abuse and neglect cycle, right? It's passed down generationally a lot of times. You would see, I don't know, just cases of, things that have gone wrong, but they're still good people. Like, I could see that they were good people, but they found themselves in a really bad spot. And I would just take that home with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was why I had to kind of shift away from that line of work. And I felt like being an attorney was a way to help people, but not necessarily be that first responder, because the emotions are so heightened when you are dealing with folks in crisis, right?
Yeah.
Right at the moment. So
I learned a term a couple of years ago called vicarious trauma.
Yes.
And it's something that you have to consider. And it's something that Chris and I also have to consider. It's because you're constantly dealing with people in crisis. And yep. Like you said, a lot of us involved in this type of work tend to be highly empathic and very sensitive. And it's difficult to pull back because people's lives are in your hands.
Absolutely. Yes. And, it's hard to compartmentalize it at times. Sometimes it was impossible. I still think of cases that I worked as a CPS worker. And I mean, we're talking, that was 10 plus years ago. So it's been a long time, and those have stuck with me. So yeah, it's vicarious trauma. I think you start, and then you also run into the really dangerous thing of compassion fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
If you stay in something too long, you then I felt like you could potentially lose that compassion that is actually a strength that we have working in this field, but you don't want to fatigue that piece of it, because then I think we are no longer effective at what
Right.
we do.
It's almost like you lose a little bit of your humanity, or a lot.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I know you said then you went on to law, but we all know that family court, there's a certain level of civility that's expected. Can you talk about how the level of civility affected you as well? Because I've seen it
Sure.
firsthand, and so have our clients, and it's just unbelievable.
Yes, it's what I've learned. We're actually, attorneys in Colorado at the very least are having to do more and more ethics training, inclusion training, diversity, all of it. And one of the things I just remember, I took a class, oh gosh, a year ago, and it was I forget what the title was, but basically the bottom line was it was the death of professionalism in our field, and civility was one of that. Because so the way I go about my business, whether I was in family law, doing criminal defense, even doing civil litigation, I look at it is that I am here to be an advocate for my client. I'm not living this life, so I should be able to take the emotion out of what they're dealing with and be the voice of reason, because I'm not living in the middle of their life. I have a special skill set and knowledge that I can bring, and I have a job to do depending on who I'm representing. Same with the other side, is they have a job and a duty to their client. And so we each have a job to do, but my philosophy is that we don't need to be fighting. We might be adversarial with each other because of whose interests we're representing, but that doesn't mean we should be unprofessional or uncivil to each other as professionals. And when I was in family law, to be honest, it wasn't necessarily the conflict that my client was dealing with their soon to be ex, or ex, and they were having custody issues, but it was the dealing with the other person's attorney, because that person, what I was seeing, was taking on basically the emotions of their client and bringing that to the table, and then we're getting nothing accomplished, because now I'm trying to be not neutral, but a little bit more emotionally uninvolved as my client's advocate. I felt like that was how I was the best advocate for my client, and yet I'm across the table from another attorney who's basically an extension of their client.
Exactly.
And it was just becoming impossible to deal with. And there's enough conflict in family law to begin with. We don't need and I always thought, well, having another attorney should make this so much easier. We've got two attorneys, we each have a job to do, but at least we can work together and take the emotion out. But I was seeing that was not how things were going, and it just became too much for me to deal with, because I'm already managing my client's emotions, and now I'm trying to manage another attorney's emotions that aren't really theirs but their clients, and that just became too difficult. It was not worth it for me.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so unfortunate because Chris has a very good friend from college who's a divorce attorney. And we were, before we did our first book, we were interviewing her and asking her about how, if you have a high conflict soon to be ex, like, are you kind of destined for a high conflict divorce? And she said, not necessarily at all, because she said, if you have two attorneys that can work together, it doesn't have to be high conflict. It can, if they manage their clients, they can get it done quickly. And that, like you, she said, that's part of my job is being really good at managing my own client, but dealing with somebody else who's an extension of a very difficult personality. How can you get anything done?
No, you don't. And it's almost worse than dealing, if that person had just been representing themselves. It almost would have been easier. And so it just became too difficult, because I worked cases where I had another attorney who felt the same way I did. And I mean, and those were some pretty high conflict issues, but man, we were able to deal with it, and it was just smooth. Yes, I had to manage my client, but I can I can handle one client. I cannot handle an attorney acting like they're part of this marriage. That just baffled me, and it was just too much.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like how can you want to be the buffer?
Yes, we should. Yes, we should be the two buffers, not, not part of the storm, so to speak.
Yeah. All right. So back to the child protective services stuff. When somebody makes a report to CPS, their identity is usually, or it's not supposed to be, disclosed. So
Correct.
how is that also weaponized?
I think so. At least in Colorado and Nevada, where I'm experienced, the reporting party's identity is known to the worker, but it legally cannot be shared with whoever they're investigating or anyone else that's involved in the case that's not part of the CPS agency. So I do believe that when you get a report, and here's the thing, I know the person's name, but I don't know necessarily always the relationship. Sometimes it would be noted on my report, what the relationship is, but not always. And so I'm going in, my first part was I had to go speak to the child first and foremost. And then I have to go interview whoever the custodial parent is, who the allegations are being made against. But it's hard to get context for their answers when they aren't sure why someone. So if they come in and they're just completely flabbergasted at the allegations that are being made against them, as a worker, I don't know, are they acting flabbergasted as a way to hide that they're, what they're actually up to? Or are they acting flabbergasted because it's truly made up allegations? And that just became hard, and the reporting party knows that their identity is going to be protected. Mm-hmm. And so they just feel it's kind of like, I call it keyboard warrior. When you're on social media, a lot of people will get on there and they'll say things that they would never say to somebody in person. Mm-hmm. I think being able to report anonymously, so to speak, to CPS, I think gives people a certain level of comfort and power, knowing that they can say whatever they want, and that can never be disclosed to the alleged perpetrator to defend against. If they knew, oh, this is my ex and this is why they're saying this, that would give a lot more context to what the allegations are. And I think it's just another way that the true perpetrators of domestic violence, it's just another way for them to continue to, use psychological warfare, I guess, against their victim.
Yeah. So I know a lot of reports come in through mandated reporters, like a teacher or a therapist. Do you think that CPS takes those a little more seriously than just from a random person who's connected with the person who's being accused?
I would say, legally speaking, they handle them all equally. Right. I would say the reality of it is that, when the worker knows who's making the report, and whether it's a mandated reporter versus a family member who we don't know what the relationship is or what it's like, I do think you take those mandated reporters a lot more seriously. But I still think that mandated reporters can still be weaponized. And I think that goes through, we hate to say it, but parents coaching their children into making allegations. And I think they can coach their children into making these allegations to mandated reporters, knowing that person is going to be required to report. So I still think even with mandated reporting, it can still be weaponized, which, if you think about it, what a scary thought process, because there's so many layers, and it's like, how do you filter through all of that to really figure out what's really going on in a family?
Yeah. And I feel like the parents coaching children to get something that they want. And that's a topic we're getting into with our current book. And I'd love to talk about that at another time, because it's such a rich topic.
Yes.
And I think you and I have a few things that we can talk about.
Yeah, we can have several episodes probably.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Tell us about what forensic interviews, like what that looked like and how it may be done poorly on children.
Yeah, so as a criminal defense attorney, I've had the opportunity to view other people's forensic interview or other workers' forensic interviews of children. When I was a CPS worker, I was a trained forensic interviewer. So it's usually CPS workers and police detectives are your two main trained forensic reporters. And so I went through a pretty extensive week-long training on how to do forensic reporting. And I'm sure even since then, it's been updated with new techniques. But what I have noticed as a criminal defense attorney, I have defended against a few cases where there have been allegations against my client that, I truly believe were false allegations against my client. And when I get to watch the forensic interview, they're done so poorly that either the worker or the detective just was never properly trained in the first place, and they're putting it off as a forensic interview when really it's just an interview by a very an untrained individual that thinks that they know how to train them or how to conduct them, when in reality they don't know what they're doing. And what I also see is the person who's doing the interview is in the interview, they're in the moment, and I don't know that they're always going back and rewatching the interview, because you can pick up, at least I was trained, you do the interview, it's usually videotaped, audio recorded, all of that, and then you should be able to go back and watch it, because you will pick up on things when you're not in the middle, because when you're in the middle of a forensic interviewer, you're thinking, I'm sure like you are right now, Lisa, you're thinking, you're trying to be an active listener, but you're also thinking about which way, when you're interviewing people, you're also thinking about which next question you're going to ask. Yeah. So you're not always able to be the most active observer that you could be. So it's always good to go back and rewatch those. And so as a criminal defense attorney, of course, I'm getting all of these forensic interviews after the fact. And so I'm watching them with a very critical eye, because I have clients who are, claiming their innocence. I mean, I think they'll take it to their grave. Mm-hmm. And what I was seeing is just really, really poorly done interviews. And then when I got into more into some of dealing with some of these agencies, what I found is one detective had not even had a forensic interview class for children, and yet he's interviewing a child for a sexual abuse allegation. And those need to be done in a very specific way. And then I had another one. It was a smaller agency where she was trained, but just not, I don't know that she's had that opportunity to do a whole lot of them. So just kind of not very well practiced. And what I found was that they were missing a lot of cues that were given in these forensic interviews that pointed to being coached. And so, not only do you get trained on how to conduct a forensic interview, but you get trained on what to look for when you're dealing with a child and the answers that they're giving. So, and how to kind of determine, are they being coached? Are they, what is the reasoning behind their answers?
It's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking about interviews I've done with attorneys for children or custody evaluators, usually attorneys for children where the client is the child. And they also have mentioned how many children have been coached and they have to kind of keep circling back with questions to keep testing it. So when you're saying rewatch something, I'm thinking that reminds me of that same thing. It's just because a child comes in and says, this is what I want, or this is what happened, that you have to really go deeper and not just accept the first thing that comes out of their mouth and why.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I think our gut, at least my gut, I want to believe children, right? I see children and animals as being the innocent people, on this planet. So you don't think, it doesn't really logically go into my mind like, oh, they might not be truthful. And here's the thing, it's not that they're trying to be deceitful. It's just that children, they can be manipulated, especially by people that they love and people that are in power over them, which unfortunately are other parents. And so what I had to remind myself is they can unfortunately be easily manipulated. And so, but our gut is to believe children. And so that's why you have to do a really good forensic interview, because if it's done very well, again, nobody's trying to blame that poor child, but you can at least start to build a case of, oh, I think this is a case of a child being coached by a parent or some other relative.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say that you sense that there was a really poor interview done. Does a parent have any recourse?
You know, it's what, here's the sad part of our system, right? My answer to that is I hope they have a good attorney, because it's, you need someone who's experienced, either whether this is in a custody case or, God forbid, this is a parent in a criminal case who's being, accused of doing something. You need to have an attorney. In my opinion, you need to have someone on your side who is well trained in spotting these issues to be able to fight it legally, because there is an opportunity that if you miss your window to have recourse, you lose that window potentially forever, or it can have just such like a snowball effect down the road. And so it's kind of to me, it's very terrifying of what can happen when, I believe, everyone means well, but they might not have the training that they needed, or have done, they're just not equipped. And so now you've created this literally chain reaction in people's lives of that. And so part of me wants to say, I hope you have a good attorney, or at least an advocate who can help you navigate that situation, because you're going to have to fight. If it's CPS, you're going to have to fight the worker and push maybe for another interview, and someone's going to now have to pay for a second forensic interview. And now you're also putting this child through multiple forensic interviews, which that's not good for them either. And then if you're in the criminal system and being falsely accused of something, you're going to have to deal with the district attorney, who you're going to be dealing with people who have probably more training than the average parent's going to have in that same situation. And so that's where advocates are going to become very important.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's like so many questions I have for you, but I see like we're getting low on time, so we're going to definitely have to make it a part 2. But I'm thinking about those false allegations, and we have, because again, we are only dealing with high conflict. We have seen and heard unbelievable stories of how people's lives have been destroyed by false allegations. Can you talk a little bit about how men are victims? Because all over social media, people assume that women are victims, that children who make allegations would never lie. And I think that we believe that abuse, there's different types of abuse, obviously.
Sure.
And there are more that are definitely towards certain genders, but we think that abuse is a human issue. So can you talk about what you've seen, because you've worked in the trenches?
Absolutely. I think I 100% agree with you that abuse is a human issue. I don't think it has gender or sex boundaries. I think it is something, abuse can be perpetuated by both men and women, both against opposite sex children, same sex children, stepchildren, biological children. I've seen it all. What I can tell you in what and there's always 3 sides to a story, right? There's one side, the other person's side, and then what really happened. And unfortunately, unless we're a fly on the wall, we never have that third perspective. But what I can tell you in just my experience, and in the 2 cases that come to mind, and I don't want to give too many details because I'd give away identities probably too easily, but I've had 2 cases. Both of my clients were men. One was a grandfather, one was a stepfather. And then I also have had another case that I worked, and it was a biological father. And they were all 3 men. And they all came to be in what I call kind of the Me Too era that we're living in. And why, and I'm not in by any means discounting that part of it. And we don't need to get into the Me
Right.
Too movement, but what I have seen is that has set the stage where you've got these public figures who are being accused, and and it's all coming out about these women being abused by men in a certain way. And what I'm seeing is that can be used against men, either grandparents, step parents, biological fathers, as a weapon, because we're living in an era right now where we want to believe women when they claim that something's happening to them. And I think men, for whatever reason, I'm not a sociologist, I'm sure you could find someone who could go into this probably in more depth, but it just seems to be an easier allegation for the police and CPS to believe that men are, and it doesn't even have to be sexual. It could be physical abuse too, because men are seen as stronger, and, it's more, men have this sociological kind of stereotype that they're the aggressor, right, all the time. And so I think it just sets a stage for that to be weaponized against them, especially in a high conflict divorce or custody situation. I mean, the stakes are very high. We're talking about custody of children. Well, what would be a sure kill shot, but to accuse the father in the situation of sexually or physically abusing their children? And so, and the cases where I've had my clients, swearing on their life that they didn't do this. And then I'm watching these forensic interviews that back up what my clients are saying, and backing up that I believe the children are being coached. And really, to me, it's really sad, because the children are the true victims here. Because you now have them being coached into having to make these allegations, some of which are terrible allegations about things that these children shouldn't know about at this age. And if someone's coaching them, now you're putting them through that, and you're using them as pawns against their parents. And it's a sad situation. But unfortunately, I've seen it multiple times, and I saw it in CPS as well, making vindictive reports against dads because they think that we'll believe that the dad was capable of that against their children.
Yeah, I recently heard a term called a silver bullet divorce. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's where and we actually met with someone, a potential client, who said her lawyer told her that at the beginning of the divorce she should immediately file for a restraining order, because that would help her win custody. And we saw a movie recently that had a recording of a lawyer telling a group of lawyers, yeah, tell your clients that they can get a leg up in a divorce if they immediately file a protective order, usually against the father, restraining order against the father, because it will help them get custody. And I was just like, oh my God.
Wow. I mean,
Right?
and it's if you're talking about a silver bullet being kind of the ultimate, like I said, a kill shot. And I mean that, in a figurative sense. I mean, it is, because the minute you start making domestic violence allegations or physical abuse allegations or sexual abuse allegations, the last thing a judge wants to do is to allow a child to be with that parent if those allegations are true, and have something really terrible happen to that kid.
Right.
You've got all these liability concerns. And so to me, it's disturbing to me that this is what attorneys are resorting to help their clients.
Right.
To me, that seems like an ethical violation, but.
Right. And you think about due process, because when somebody makes an allegation like that, then a parent, and it doesn't just happen to men, but a parent is not allowed to be around the child. So that establishes the foundation of the case already, where they haven't seen the child for a while. And then there's all kinds of things that go on, and it makes it harder, so, and when people do this, they ruin it for true victims.
Correct. And I think that's my frustration, is that we're talking about this vindictive reporting and this and that and how awful it is and how prevalent it is. And then which it's terrible because you're ruining innocent lives over, out of, trying to be vindictive. But then you're also ruining lives because the true cases that are super dangerous are going to fall through the cracks because people are going to get so desensitized, especially if you are finding out that attorneys are telling other attorneys, this is how you should work your case. Well, if I know that, I'm going to assume every allegation now is just part of being vindictive when in fact it could actually be legitimate.
Right.
And
right.
You're putting other people's lives at risk over I don't know what. And I think it plays into the historical stereotypes of men too. Right? We have these historical stereotypes that men are the violent ones, that they're the aggressive ones. And as you know, and I know, women can be just as much of a perpetrator of abuse as a man can.
Right. And so, everybody lies. All genders lie. That's human nature. So I don't think it's fair to just assume that because somebody is a certain gender that they always tell the truth.
Exactly.
That just paves the way for fraud, among other things.
Yep, absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been real. Oh, well, actually, before I forget, one more question. Any tips for people dealing with CPS? It's a terrifying experience to suddenly get a call that like somebody's made a report on you. So let's assume it's one of our clients who's been, falsely accused of something, because it happens all the time. Any tips that they should know or think?
I think that's great. So absolutely, the first reaction is always going to be fear, because you see someone, you see CPS, they're an extension of the government, and they, you see them as having all the power, and you believe that who's going to believe me when they're doing this investigation. So I think the first tip is to try to avoid the catastrophizing that we all are going to do when we're found in that situation, which I know is easier said than done. Mm-hmm. But really the biggest thing that I can advise is be cooperative with CPS. Open up your home, especially if you don't have anything to hide. Open up your home, let them interview the child, and I'm sure someone's going to listen to this and they're going to be like, yeah, but what about the bad caseworker who's, a bad apple? Well, I would say those are the minority. I think the majority of caseworkers are trying to do a good job. And so, you open up your house, let them see the house, let them talk to your kids, let them talk to friends and family. And a lot of people have a lot of shame around that being reported for this, even when they haven't done anything. There's a lot of shame.
Because people don't believe it. They think that, how could this happen? You must have done something.
If there's an allegation, you must have done something. And that's why I'm so glad you're doing this episode, because if the more we can educate people that doesn't always mean anything, right? It can easily be vindictive. So I know there's a lot of shame around it, but find your safe people that are in your life. Share with them what's going on. Let them know what's happening. Because then you'll have the support and you will have people who can back you up. The worst thing you can do is fight this alone. I think bringing in the people that are safe in your life. And when I say safe, don't give this ammo to someone who's in your life, a family member who's in your life who might use it against you, who might weaponize this against you. But find those truly safe people that are in your life who know you really well as a parent. Let them know what's going on. But also don't give them too much information either. Let them, I think we want to stand up for ourselves and explain away what's going on. And I think the best way to do that when you're talking to family and friends is, look, I've been reported. I believe it's probably some sort of vindictive reporting. I don't know. They're going to want to talk to you about who I am as a parent. And tell them and have them tell that person, I believe you know me as a parent and you know who I truly am. And if you wouldn't mind speaking with them and giving them, your honest feedback on how I am as a parent, it would be very helpful. But I think we want to jump when we're found in this situation. We want to jump to defending ourselves. That's our kind of first, just let it happen organically. as much as possible, but don't go it alone. Definitely bring in those safe people that are in your lives to help you through it. And like I said, if you've done nothing wrong and you have nothing to hide, let the CPS worker into your house, let them talk to your kids. And I think they will truly, if they're doing a good job and you give them the access that they need, I think they're going to determine that there's not a whole lot going on here, and they're going to hopefully close the case as unfounded. That's the hope.
Oh, great. Oh my gosh. Evynne, like I started saying before, this is super helpful. This is just part one.
Yes.
You
yes, I look forward
like,
to many more.
2 more topics.
Yes.
So before we go, can you just tell people, I know you're not doing CPS anymore, but how can people find you?
Absolutely. So my name is Evynne Fair, and I am located in Colorado. My law firm that I own is called Oakmont Law Group. That's OAKMONT.LAW is the website. So it's oakmont.law, and you can find me online, and I'm always happy to jump on a call, to chat, to walk someone through what they're going through.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much, Evynne, and we will definitely be following up soon.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate you having me on, and this time flew. We had a great time.
I know.
Over a lot of good stuff.
All right. Talk soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.